Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for our 30 on Thursday webinar, Capacity Planning and Introduction on how to size and architect a SharePoint farm. If this is your first time joining us, our 30 on Thursday webinar series is brought to you by Protiviti, and we are a global consulting firm that helps companies solve problems in finance, technology, operations, governance, risk, and audit. We serve over 40% of the Fortune 1000 and Fortune 500 companies. Our ECM group is within the IT consulting group of Protiviti. We are in over 70 offices in over 20 countries. Our 30 on Thursday webinar series are 30-minute webinars where we talk all things SharePoint and enterprise content management. Our next webinar will be on July 28th, where we will be talking about how to leverage SharePoint to manage your audit program. You can register for that webinar and see our full schedule on our website, ecm.protiviti.com/webinars. We are offering free 1-hour introductory consultations for everyone on the call today for our on-demand SharePoint support team. They help with performance troubleshooting, system health checks, Nintex workflows, business intelligence, and so much more. If you're interested in scheduling a free 1 hour, you can email us at Protiviti at ecm@protiviti.com, or you can learn more on our website. We are doing live tweeting today during the webinar. Please tweet us your questions and feedback at Protiviti ECM and use the hashtag 30TSharePoint. Today's session is being recorded. The recording of today's session will be on our YouTube channel with an archive of our past sessions. For questions during today's presentation, we will be saving them all for the end. If you insert them in the question window, we will get to those after the presentation, or please tweet us your questions using the hashtag 30TSharePoint. Today's presenter is Doug Hemminger, 3-time SharePoint MVP and Senior Manager here at Protiviti. So let's get started. Doug, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Julia. All right, today we're going to talk about capacity planning, and just to set the stage a little bit, we've only got 30 minutes, and this is obviously a very broad topic where we could get in depth in a lot of different areas. So what I've done is just kind of taken a few tidbits and snippets that will hopefully be some helpful planning tools and guidelines for planning your SharePoint environment. So it's not going to cover everything, obviously, but we will cover a good chunk of a few different areas that will hopefully get you started on it. The other thing I want to point out is that for purposes of this discussion, I do kind of talk along the lines of SharePoint 2013, but a lot of the same planning guidelines apply to any on-premises installation of SharePoint, including SharePoint 2016, although the server infrastructure would be a little bit different in SharePoint 2016. If someone wants to understand that, we can take that offline, and you can email me afterwards or tweet to me, and we can talk about how it looks in SharePoint 2016. So what is capacity planning? I've sort of defined it as estimating the computer storage, hardware, software, and networking resources required over a specified period of time. And the period of time is really important to understand that that is a component of capacity planning. No amount of planning will ever set you right for the indefinite future. You have to set some sort of time period in your planning phase. And usually what I recommend for SharePoint is sort of a 2 to 3 year time horizon. Beyond that, it starts to get really hazy as to whether or not you can even accurately predict any kind of hardware requirements beyond 2 to 3 years. So I usually cut it off at 2 to 3 years. Sometimes some companies do it as little as 1 year, though. So just think about what your time horizon should be, or what you would like to predict it to be. And the other thing to keep in mind is estimates for usage in your environment should reflect peak usage. The key scenario that I like to talk about with clients is that the CEO at lunchtime sends out an email to the entire company with a link to someplace on the SharePoint environment saying, go check this out. That is definitely not the time when you want your SharePoint environment to be overloaded and go down because of high usage. But you are obviously going to get a lot of hits at that point in time. So you have to think about through these scenarios and think about what is going to be our peak usage, not only for accessing the website, but also for storage as well. So I've got a little bit just to kind of think through the methodology and how you capacity plan. The first step is to gather information about the number of environments you're going to be setting up, dev, test, prod, and disaster recovery. What features are going to be deployed, and we'll get into those in a little bit. And then some key usage characteristics. Most of this session, this 30-minute session, will focus on the gathering information phase, and then we'll talk a little bit about the design phase, where you actually make decisions about, based on your information that you've gathered, how to set up your hardware and software. And then lastly, you would build and deploy your environment and then monitor and adjust. And I can't stress enough how important it is to monitor and adjust your environment. Obviously, any kind of estimates that you make on usage will probably need to be adjusted based on actual usage that goes into place. So please make sure that you do follow. We're not going to go into it in a lot of detail here, but make sure you include that as part of your methodology, is monitoring and adjusting. So the first thing to think about is how many environments you're going to be setting up. If you're doing a new installation, I always recommend you have, we always start at 3 environments. Development environment, which usually has sort of a small footprint, 1 to 3 servers, just a web server, maybe an application server, and then a database server. The purpose of the development environment, obviously, is to do any kind of development that will later be deployed to QA, where it can be tested, and then to production, where it can be implemented for use. For the test environment, I always recommend that it's an exact replica of production, because you're going to be doing patches in your test environment before you do them in production. So any kind of SharePoint patching, other software patching, should be done in your test environment, or your staging environment, as it's sometimes called as well, before you do it in production. And in order to accurately test the patching process, you need to have an environment that matches production. So I strongly recommend that your test environment be basically a replica of your production environment. So typically, when you're setting up a new SharePoint installation, you would set up 3 environments: development, test, and production. There may be more. Sometimes test is separated from staging, where you do a lot of QA and development. You may have a separate test environment and then a separate staging environment before you deploy it to production to just test out the deployment process. Okay. So now that you know what kind of environments they're going to set up, the next thing to think about is what features will be required. And the main questions that you need to answer is, are you going to deploy Office Web Apps, SharePoint 2013 workflow, business intelligence capabilities, and are you going to use is your environment going to need to be highly available? Office Web Apps gives you the ability to view Office documents, Excel, Word, and so on, within the browser when you're accessing them in SharePoint. So this means that when you click on an Office document that's stored on SharePoint, you don't actually need Word installed locally. You can view it directly from within the browser. It also has a nice capability in that when you're doing searches within SharePoint, you can preview the document that you're searching on right directly in the browser without the need for downloading it and opening it up within the native client software. So Office Web Apps is a nice thing. However, you need additional servers for Office Web Apps. Typically, I recommend that Office Web Apps be installed on its own server. and the same is true for SharePoint 2013 workflow. SharePoint 2013 workflow capabilities give you the ability to design workflows within SharePoint Designer and leverage the SharePoint 2013 Windows Workflow Foundations capabilities. And again, this needs separate servers set up, so that's why we always ask what features are going to be required. Business intelligence, if you're installing Power Pivot, you'll need SQL Server Analysis Services, which a lot of times can be installed on the same SQL Server instance as your SharePoint server or SharePoint databases, but sometimes you may want to segregate that out into a separate SQL server. And lastly, are you going to need this environment to be highly available? If you need high availability, you're going to need duplicates of each of the servers that you're setting up. Next, you're going to need to take into consideration some of your usage characteristics. So the first thing you want to figure out is your existing storage requirements. So you would list out all your existing data sources, so content databases, file shares, etc. And then estimate your total current storage size based on that. So for example, if you figure out my current environment has 5 terabytes of data, that would be your estimated current total storage size. And then you would average and estimate your anticipated monthly storage growth and project that out over the course of your time horizon. So if you selected two years to be your estimating horizon, you would estimate roughly what that storage growth is going to be at the end of those 2 years. And then you would size your databases to the size it's going to be at the end of those 2 years. So if we started with 5 terabytes and we estimated that it's going to grow to 7 terabytes, we would set up our databases initially, and when we created our environment, to be 7 terabytes. Some other key usage characteristics are requests per second and total number of users. And due to time limitations, I'm not going to get into a lot of details as to how to translate that into actual server characteristics. But keep in mind that once you just know that in order to properly estimate and size a web server, for example, you need to figure out roughly how many requests per second and total number of users you're going to have, so that you can translate that into some usage statistics that you can figure out, then use to figure out the number of CPUs and the total memory that it's going to use. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking through like a sample diagram of what this is what a production environment could look like. You'll notice that it's got 2 SharePoint web servers. And one other thing I should point out here is this doesn't have all the server characteristics. Those are included later on, and we'll talk about those in a second. So in other words, the actual number of CPUs, how fast are the CPUs, how much memory does it have, what are the disk drives, things like that. Those come later. So at first, you kind of want to map out your environment, the number of servers you're going to need based on the environment and the features that you're going to be installing. So you can see that in this case, this is a highly available environment. We've got 2 web servers, so that if one web server goes down, another one can take over. These will be load balanced by some kind of load balancing device. And then we also have 3 Windows Workflow servers. Again, highly available situation. So those will handle SharePoint 2013 workflows using the Windows Workflow Foundation. Note that in Windows Workflow Server, in order for it to be highly available, it has to have 3 because you have to have a witness server. So there 2 does not work. So you need 1. If you just want 1, it's fine. But if you want to have it be highly available, you need 3. That's not the case with Office Web Apps, however. You can get away with 2 on Office Web Apps. So in this case, this environment has 2 Office Web App servers. And then we've got a couple of SharePoint application servers that serve the purpose of running all the SharePoint services like search and business connectivity services, and user profile service, and things like that. And lastly, we've got 2 SQL servers set up with always on. So the two SQL servers, again, are highly available. With SQL Always On, they're constantly replicating with each other, so that should the active SQL server fail, it will automatically fail over to the passive SQL server. So this is a sample basic production environment that is highly available. It includes Office Web Apps, Windows Workflow Server, and SQL Server Always On. So just to give you an example of once we've identified what the SQL what the environment's supposed to look like, the number of servers, and what features are going to be installed, then we start figuring out, okay, how are we actually going to set up each of these servers? And right now I've just included a sample of a web server, but based on the usage characteristics, you would figure out and translate into those usage characteristics into an actual web server specification. So you would say it's got, in this case, it has 4 virtual CPUs, 24 gig of RAM, running Windows Server 2012 R2. It's got 120 gig OS drive and 80 gig log drive and 1 network adapter. So this gives the specification for the web server so that it can be built out to those specifications. Database gets a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through how to size a database. First, you have to allocate 2 gigabytes for the configuration database and 1 gigabyte for the central administration content database. Those don't really change. Those are the same throughout the life of the SharePoint installation. But again, you need to size your content databases to what you expect them to grow to in roughly 2 to 3 years. And Microsoft actually gives us a formula for sizing a database. And this formula is a little bit outdated in that it's going to give you a little bit inflated numbers if you follow it exactly, because there's some things have been introduced since this formula came about, like shredded storage and such. But you basically, it's very helpful if you've got a bunch of file share documents that you're putting on SharePoint, though, because you can take the number of documents, multiply the number of non-current versions, and the average size of each document, and use that to come up with how many items are going to be, or how much storage space it's going to need once it's added to SharePoint. So storage is just one component of designing your database, though. One of the most important things when designing your database is your disk speed. And I have done countless performance evaluations for clients that say that their SharePoint is running slow, it's not responding fast, and I would say a good majority of the time it boils down to the disk subsystem on the database, because they're not running enough IOPS, the IO input outputs per second, that is necessary to achieve an acceptable performance level. What's recommended is a disk subsystem performance of 0.25 IOPS per gigabyte. Between 0.25 and 2 IOPS per gigabyte is recommended. So in the example I give, a 100 gigabyte content database should be on a disk that supports 25 to 200 IOPS. If you have 8 content databases of that size sharing a disk, you would plan for 200 to 1,600 IOPS. And what I recommend, a lot of times organizations have this specific functionality, like managing the disk subsystem, segregated out to a different group of people within the organization. What I recommend is just communicating with them in terms of IOPS, saying, you know, I've got these big databases, I need 500 IOPS in order for this to perform effectively. And then the people who work on the disk subsystem can set that up appropriately. But then the important thing is to go back and test it. So once your environment is set up and you get to the point where, okay, you've got your production environment, you know, basically set up, or they've turned over the SQL servers to you, then you need to test the disk subsystem. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this course, but there are ways to test the IOPS using some out-of-the-box Microsoft testing tools. But here's an example SQL Server specification. with all the disks on a single disk array, 4 CPUs, 64 gig RAM, Windows Server 2012 R2, and then 5,000, in this case 5,000 IOPS needed for the drives listed below, and it's separated out into an OS drive, a SQL drive, a data drive, a log drive, a temp data, and a temp log drive. And then there's a network adapter speed. Okay. So we've kind of gone through the gather info. You need to figure out the number of environments, the features to be deployed, and the key usage statistics. And once you've identified all that information, you can translate that into an actual design. Basically, the hardware configuration of each server in each environment, and the software and components to be installed. Once the design is done, you would build and deploy. So you build the servers and configure the infrastructure to accommodate the design. And then lastly, and just as importantly as any of the other steps, you need to monitor and adjust. So validate the usage and adjust the infrastructure accordingly over time. So I ended a few minutes early, and I have some time for some questions. I'm not sure if anybody has any questions, but we can take a few questions.
Yep, we do have a few. If anyone has questions, insert them in the question window, and we will get to those now. One question, how do you plan capacity for search?
Okay, so search is, so actually I'm just going to go back to one of my slides here. The one thing about search is a SharePoint service that sits on the application servers, or if you've segregated it out, it may sit on its own SharePoint servers just running search by itself. Search can be a huge strain on the system in SharePoint 2013. Microsoft re-architected search, and it's significantly better in SharePoint 2013 than in previous versions and in 2016. But it's a beast. It takes up a lot of resources. So there is some guidance on how to set up search, and I actually have a slide that I hid here. I'll unhide this. So there are basically 4 different key components of search: a crawl component, link component, analytics, reporting, and search administration. And I'm not going to go through everything on this slide, but basically you need to set up your components based on how many documents you have in your environment, or how many items that it's going to be crawling. So the crawl component needs 1 database per 20 million items, and then the SQL IOPS is 10 per 1 document per second. So you need sort of high IOPS for your crawl component with a medium disk size. And it gives you some estimates. So if you've got 100 million items, you're going to have a database size of about 110 gigabytes and a 50 gigabyte log size. So this gives you some guidance on how to set up your search and plan for it accordingly. If you have an environment that has more than 10 million items, you need to start thinking about how do we plan for search. Do we put it on a separate server? We need to figure out how much size the database are going to take up, etc. Okay, next question.
Okay, great. We've got a couple more coming in. So first is, how should Office Web Apps be on a single server or its own farm?
Should Office Web Apps be on a single server or its own farm? I typically set up Office Web Apps exactly like almost every installation I do it like this, where high availability is required. I put it on in a farm situation where it's got 2 servers. The thing with setting it up with more than 1 server is you need to load balance the servers so that they can be accessed correctly by SharePoint. So I typically, in high availability situations, you want to have at least two Office Web App servers so that you can, if one of them goes down, then the other one can pick it up. If high availability is not a concern for you, for Office web apps, then you can just do one server. I hope that answered it.
Yeah. Okay, great. How would you perform a server requirement analysis for hybrid approach on-premise and SharePoint Online?
How would you do a server analysis for hybrid approach? Okay, so it depends on what you're doing on-premises versus online. I've run into situations where the on-premises hybrid is really just there for BCS, or Business Connectivity Services. And in that regard, it's really just kind of a shell of SharePoint. It's not, you're not really using or exposing all of SharePoint. You're just using it to leverage the BCS connection for your SharePoint Online websites. If you're using SharePoint on-prem, however, to run, say, an intranet, and you're using online for other stuff, for an extranet, for example, you still need to go through the same analysis that you would for any on-prem installation. So there's sort of two things there. If you're doing it on-prem just for the BCS connection, then you just need a basic setup with maybe one or two servers that just handle the BCS connection. But if you're hosting actual sites, like in an intranet on your on-prem portion, and you're connecting search to it and all that stuff, you would do it exactly the same way as you would a regular on-prem installation.
Okay, great. We are using Fast Search with SharePoint 2010. Do we need a separate server for that?
Fast Search for 2010 needs a separate server, yes. But if you're using Fast Search, I mean, more and more clients are switching to 2013 because the search was basically re-architected in 2013. You no longer need a separate server, but in 2010 you do.
Okay, great. And then we had another question about the slides and the recording. That will be sent out to all the attendees after today's presentation. We had a question, build and deploy, what are the best guidelines? Should those be done manually or through automated scripts?
So for build and deploy, when I say build and deploy, it's kind of a broad term. There's the first step to build and deploy is to build out the servers with the OSs and the RAM and the CPUs and such. And most clients nowadays are doing that via some kind of virtual, whether it's Hyper-V or VMware or something like that. They're setting up their servers through as virtual machines. So that's phase one, is setting up the actual machine. Then phase two is like laying on the software. So SQL I usually install manually. Office web apps I install manually. Workflow Foundation I usually install manually. SharePoint I script. So usually when I set up SharePoint, I use AutoSP Installer, which is a free installer tool on CodeFlex that you can script the whole thing.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions for today. Yep. All right. Well, thank you all for attending today. Thank you, Doug, for the great presentation. There was a lot of great information there.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
We will be sending out the link to the recording and the presentation probably on Monday of next week. And we hope to see you guys in 2 weeks where we talk about SharePoint for auditing. Have a great day.